My name is Jessica Robbins, and I'm an AmeriCorps volunteer serving at the College of Menominee Nation. I'm really happy to be recording this video for you all today because this is a subject that I'm really passionate about. I graduated from Lawrence University in Appleton last year, where I did research on native bees. Before starting my research, I really thought I knew a fair amount about bees, but I soon realized that there was much more to learn, and that bees are much more fascinating than I thought they were. I'm going to share some of those discoveries with you today, and I hope they're as interesting for you as they were for me. So before we jump in, I want to tell you a little bit about AmeriCorps first, and specifically AmeriCorps Vista, which is the program that I'm in. AmeriCorps is a network of national service programs. It's made up of 3 primary programs, of which Vista is one of them, and they're all a little bit different, but they all have a few things in common. First of all, AmeriCorps positions are always temporary, and in Vista, they're usually a year long. My position is a year long, so I'm guaranteed a job with AmeriCorps for that year, and then after that, I get to move on to something else. Another commonality is that all AmeriCorps programs are community service related. The purpose of AmeriCorps is to help local communities, and that can be through a variety of ways, from healthcare to housing to schools, but the purpose is always to make people's lives better by helping their local communities. So I had a few reasons for joining AmeriCorps. First was that I wanted to make a positive change in the world, and AmeriCorps is all about that. Second, I wanted to gain experience that would help me in future jobs. AmeriCorps is a really great way to gain experience and to explore different career options. You don't need a lot of experience for most AmeriCorps positions, so it's a good way to get started and get that experience that you'll need for other jobs. And also, since all AmeriCorps positions are temporary, it's a good way to try out new things. If you like what you're doing in your AmeriCorps service, then you know to look for that in future jobs. So for example, a big part of my job is working in the CMN Collaborative Garden. And through that, I've learned that I really enjoy working outside. So I'm going to try to look for that in future jobs after my service ends. And I've also learned a lot about gardening, which will help me in future jobs. AmeriCorps will also give you an education award when you finish your service, and that's money that can go towards either future education or student loans. And if you want to work in the federal government, serving in AmeriCorps gives you a big advantage when applying for government jobs. You have to be at least 18 years old to join, and it's pretty popular among people who are just finishing high school or college, but there's no upper age limit. You can be at any age and any point in your career to join AmeriCorps. Okay, so let's get started talking about bees. I took these pictures at the Shawano Historical Society, which is right near the sheriff's office. These are bumblebees on the left and a honeybee on the right. And I'm showing you these pictures because I want to show you just how easy it is to find bees when you're out and about. When I was walking by these flowers, I saw one bumblebee and I stopped to take a picture for this webinar, but then I realized there wasn't just one bumblebee. Almost every flower on this bush had a bee on it. And I wasn't afraid when I saw them because I know that if I don't get in their way, they won't get in my way. So I just stopped and took a few pictures, staying a safe distance back from the bees so that I didn't get in their way and didn't bother them. And it was totally fine. The bees didn't even care that I was there. They were just too busy pollinating. So my challenge to you is, next time you're walking outside and you see some flowers, although that might not be until next spring at this point, just take a minute to stop and find some bees, because you'll probably be able to see them in action. So before we really dive into bees, I want to take some time to talk about the difference between bees and wasps, because they're really easy to get confused, and I hear people getting them confused all the time. Wasps and bees look different, and they have different lifestyles. The biggest difference is in what they eat. Adult wasps eat nectar, whereas adult bees eat both nectar and pollen. This means that bees are more likely to spread pollen from flower to flower, making them better pollinators. Another difference is that wasp larvae, those are the baby wasps, which you see on the picture on the left here, they're carnivorous, meaning they eat other insects. So adult wasps actually capture other insects, especially caterpillars, like you see in the picture on the right, and they bring them back to the hive for the larvae to eat. This means that wasps are helpful sometimes because they can eat pest insects. So I mentioned that wasps don't eat pollen, but bees do, and that affects the way that they look. Bees actually collect pollen and stick it to special hairs on their legs called scopa. When this collection of pollen gets big enough, it can form a little ball or pollen basket, which you see on the right here. Because wasps aren't interested in pollen, they will never have a pollen basket. Wasps also tend to be more brightly colored than bees, although that's not true in every case. Wasps have small waists and long legs that dangle down when they fly, whereas bees tend to have more compact bodies. You might have heard that bees can only sting once, and that is true. After a bee stings, its stinger is ripped out of its body, which kills it. However, that's not true for wasps. They can sting multiple times, so watch out for that. Okay, so now that you know a little bit about the difference between wasps and bees, here's a game to test your skills. I'm going to show you pictures of 5 different insects, and you decide if you think it's a bee or a wasp. You can take some time to pause the video if you need to, but after a few seconds, I'll reveal the answer. Okay, let's go. Bee or wasp? It's a wasp. You can tell by its small waist, its bright colors, and the fact that it doesn't have any hair on its legs. What about this one, bee or wasp? It's a bee. You can see the hairs on its legs. And again, this one is a bee, and you can tell from the hairs on its legs and the way its body is sort of compact. This one is definitely a wasp. You can see it's not hairy at all. It's got that really thin waist and long legs. And this is a bit more of a tricky one. It's actually a bee, and I included this because it has those bright colors that wasps tend to have, so it can be a little confusing, but you can see it is pretty hairy still, and it has sort of that compact body that bees tend to have. Good job, everyone! Okay, so now that we're all experts at identifying wasps and bees, let's talk about the different types of bees. I'm going to tell you about 3 types: solitary bees, bumblebees, and honeybees. All bees fit into one of these categories based on their life cycle and social organization. In each of these categories, there are many, many different species. We'll talk more about what species means later, but right now it's just important to note that these are not species categories. They're broader categories based on how the bees live. So let's start off by talking about the bees you've all heard about, honeybees. This is probably what most people think of when they think of bees. Honeybees live in hives, which are groups of thousands of individuals. Every bee in the hive has a job, and every hive has a queen who lays all the eggs. And of course, they use nectar from flowers to make honey that will feed the hive throughout the winter. Honeybees have the most complex social organization of any bees because they live in groups of thousands of individuals, and each one has a job, like I said. Bumblebees are similar to honeybees, but not quite the same. Like honeybees, bumblebees also have a queen. The queen emerges in the spring and starts building a nest, which is what you see on the picture on the right. And you can see it kind of looks similar to a honeybee's honeycomb, but it's a little bit different. The queen will lay eggs that grow into worker bees that then help her to grow and build the nest. These groups of bumblebees are called colonies, and they're much smaller than honeybee hives, usually only a couple hundred individuals versus thousands in the honeybee hives. Surprisingly, bumblebees also make honey, but because their colonies are so much smaller, they don't make enough for humans to harvest. And finally, solitary bees. They're my favorite because they're not as well known as the other 2 types. You might know solitary bees as ground bees, and that's because they often dig their nests in the ground. Unlike honeybees and bumblebees, they don't live in groups. Each female is a queen, and she builds her own nest all by herself. She starts by digging a hole in the ground. Then she collects a bunch of pollen and places it in the nest. She lays an egg on that collection of pollen, then seals it off with a wall of mud. Then she repeats the process over and over until the nest is full. The larvae will hatch and eat the pollen throughout the winter. Then they'll go into a cocoon where they'll turn into adult bees. In the spring, they emerge and start the process all over again. So now that you know a lot about bees, I'm going to give you a little challenge. This image was part of a study on the public's knowledge of bees. Participants in the study were shown this image and asked to identify which of these insects are bees. So now it's your turn. Take a moment to decide which of these are bees. You can pause the video on this screen if you need more time, and I'll reveal the answers in a few seconds. So here we go. Here are the ones that are not bees. Did any of these surprise you? Sometimes people are surprised that number 7 and number 10 are bees because they have those bright metallic colors. And number 9 often tricks people because it kind of looks like a bee, but if you look closely, it actually doesn't have wings. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about species, and I mentioned that there are many different species of bees. Now let's talk about what a species is. The biological definition of a species is a group of similar organisms that can produce fertile offspring. That's a little confusing, so let's break it down. Species is a scientific definition that helps us to understand living creatures. We group organisms into categories called species based on their similarities. If two organisms are in the same species, then they are very similar to each other in the way they behave, the way they look, where they live, and their DNA. It also means that they can reproduce and that their offspring will be able to reproduce. Here we have two different species of bumblebees, Bombus fervidus and Bombus impatiens. They're both bumblebees, but they're different species. You can see that they look a little different. One has a yellow abdomen and one has a black abdomen. They also live in different places. Bombus impatiens is found in the eastern United States, whereas Bombus fervidus is more common in the west. These two bumblebees could not mate with each other because genetically they're just too different. So we consider them to be different species. Now, if we take a look at their species names, Bombus fervidus and Bombus impatiens, you probably know that all species have two names like that. The first one is the genus name, and a genus is a group of species. Then the second one indicates what species specifically. So you can see these two are both in the same genus, the Bombus genus, which is the bumblebees. So the same is true for plants. These are both milkweeds. They're in the genus Asclepias, which all the milkweeds are in, but they are different species. So like the bumblebees, they look similar, but they have slight differences. You can see differences in the shapes of their flowers. They also live in slightly different places in North America, and they like slightly different soil conditions. Okay, time for a pop quiz. I want to give you a chance to guess at these questions because I think the answers might surprise you. So keeping in mind what we just learned about species, take a guess at the answers to these questions. How many bee species are there in the whole world? And how many in North America? I'll give you a few seconds. You can write down your answers, and then I'll reveal the answer. And again, you can pause the video if you need more time. Okay, ready for the answers? There are 20,000 species of bees in the world. 20,000, that's so many. And in North America specifically, we have 4,000. So how do all of those species fit into the three categories that we were talking about? Honeybees, solitary bees, and bumblebees. Well, it might surprise you to know that only 9 bee species of the 20,000 in the world are honeybees. And actually, most honeybees in the US are just one species, which is APHIS mellifera, and that species is native to Europe. So moving on, there are about 250 bumblebee species in the world. Now, if we do the math, that means that the remaining 19,741 species are all solitary bees. That's almost 99% of species. So now you can see why I think solitary bees are the most important. Okay, so now for a very important question. Which bee is the coolest? These are all solitary bees. So take a minute, maybe consult with your friends, decide which bee you think looks the coolest, and then I'll tell you which one I think looks the coolest. Okay, I hope you had a few seconds to discuss. My personal favorite is number 1, Agapostemon texanus. The bees in the Agapostemon genus all have this certain look to them where they have a shiny metallic greenish blue top and then a striped black and yellow bottom. And I just think that looks so cool. I've seen a few of them here in Wisconsin. So maybe when you guys are out looking for bees, you'll find some as well. So like I mentioned, there are 4,000 species of bees in North America. Of those, most are solitary, and 70% of them nest in the ground. There are no honeybees that are native to North America. So the remaining 30% of bees that don't nest in the ground are probably bumblebees and solitary bees that don't nest in the ground. Some solitary bees will actually nest in hollow twigs, or they might build their nests out of mud against a surface like a rock or a fallen tree. So of the 4,000 species in North America, many are at risk of extinction and all are experiencing population declines or loss of habitat. That's very sad because our native North American bees do a lot of good for humans and the environment. People have started realizing the importance of bees in recent years, and a lot of people are aware that bee populations are declining. It's a great thing that people have more awareness of this problem, but unfortunately, most of the public don't know about the importance of native bees, or they don't know the difference between solitary bees, bumblebees, and honeybees like you guys do now. There's been a lot of focus on honeybees recently because of colony collapse disorder. However, honeybees are not in danger of going extinct, and many native bees are. Here are two important examples of endangered bees. The Hawaiian yellow-faced bee is endemic to Hawaii, and that means that it lives there and nowhere else. It was the first bee species to be added to the U.S. Endangered Species List in 2016. To the right is the rusty patch bumblebee, which was the first bumblebee species to be added to that list in 2017. Since then, more bees have been added, and there are many more species that have declining populations but aren't considered endangered yet. So where do wildflowers come in? I said in the beginning, this is a presentation about bees and flowers, and your activity for this month is about wildflowers. So why are bees and flowers so inseparable? And by the way, this is a picture I took of a bumblebee on some milkweed in the CMN garden. So the reason bees and flowers are inseparable is pollination. Bees rely on flowers for food, while flowers rely on bees for pollination. Let's talk a little bit about how pollination works. The purpose of a flower is to make fruits and seeds for the plant. Flowers have two important parts that help to accomplish this goal. First is the anther, which is where the pollen comes from. Second is the stigma, which is where the pollen needs to go to create a seed. Most flowers can't move pollen from anther to stigma on their own, so they need some help. Some flowers release their pollen and let the wind carry it, but many plants rely on bees and other insects to move their pollen around. So how do bees do that? How do they move pollen around? Like I mentioned before, bees need pollen, not only for their own nourishment, but for their babies as well. Bees collect pollen on little hairs on their body called scopa, which you can see in these pictures on the right. Then they take the pollen back to their nests and leave it as a meal for their growing larvae. While bees are collecting pollen for themselves, they end up unintentionally spreading it around from flower to flower and from anther to stigma. You can see these bees are pretty messy. They've got pollen all over themselves. So it's not hard to imagine when they're walking around a flower that they can unintentionally end up spreading the pollen from the anther to the stigma and then spreading that pollen to another flower to pollinate that as well. And so that's how bees pollinate flowers. Bees are important to humans because they don't just pollinate wildflowers, they also pollinate our crops. Not all crops rely on bees for pollination. For example, you guys probably know that corn is pollinated by wind. But many species do rely on bees for pollination, like strawberries, blueberries, tomatoes, squash, and more. It's estimated that 2/3 of the world's crops rely on insects, and especially bees, for pollination. Strawberries are a great example. The strawberry on the left was pollinated by bees, and the two on the right were not. Without bees, we likely wouldn't have strawberries. So if you like strawberries, you care about bees. Bees and flowers are essential to each other. Each needs the other. But what about native bees? Why should we care if native bees specifically go extinct? We could just replace them all with honeybees, right? Not exactly. The incredible thing about native bees and wildflowers is that they evolved together. Over the course of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, bees and wildflowers have become specialized to each other. This means that some bee species are just really good at getting pollen out of certain wildflowers. These two are excellent examples. These are both wildflowers that grow in our local area, and you've probably seen them before. On the top is black-eyed Susan, which is in the genus Rudbeckia. And remember we talked about how a genus is a group of similar species. Then underneath is bergamot, which you might know as number 6, and it's in the genus Monarda. These wildflowers are both native to the area, and the interesting thing is, if you look at the names of these bees, they're actually named after the flowers that they pollinate. We have Andrena rudbeckiae, which likes to pollinate the Rudbeckia, and Duphoria monardae, which likes to pollinate Monarda. These bees specialize on these flowers, and they might visit other flowers as well, but these ones are their favorites, and they really rely on them. They're so interconnected that if one species were to go extinct, the other might as well. That's why if we want to protect wildflowers, we also need to protect the native bees that pollinate them. And if we want to protect the native bees, we must also protect the wildflowers. I want to read you this quote from the National Wildlife Federation because I think it's particularly relevant to what we're talking about. Before European settlers arrived, unique wildflower species covered the American landscape. Today, nearly 1/4 of the 20,000 known native flowering plant species in the United States are considered threatened or of conservation concern. I think lots of people today care about conservation of species, but unfortunately plant species are often overlooked because people tend to focus on the cute and cuddly animals like panda bears, polar bears, and even bees tend to get more attention than wildflowers. So in the spirit of paying attention to endangered plants, I want to talk to you about an endangered plant that I know a little bit about, which is the pitcher's thistle. One of my former biology professors at Lawrence University studies pitcher's thistle, and these pictures were taken by one of her students, who's also my friend. Pitcher's thistle can be found on dunes along the Great Lakes. The plant thrives in sand, although most other plants would find sand very difficult to grow in. This is because sand doesn't hold water very well. You can see this if you've ever dug a hole in the sand at the beach. When you start digging, the sand is dry, but once you reach a certain depth, the sand is suddenly wet. Water tends to trickle through sand quickly and end up at the bottom, which makes it hard for plant roots to reach the water. The pitcher's thistle has solved this problem by having a really long taproot, up to 6 feet long. That way it can reach water far below the surface when the surface is dry. It's a really interesting plant because it can live for as long as 8 years before flowering. It waits for the perfect conditions, then after flowering and producing seeds just once, the plant dies. Habitat destruction has threatened the pitcher's thistle in recent years, which is scary because we don't know what would happen to the ecosystem if it went extinct completely. The picture on the left is of a native bee visiting the flower, and on the right is a wasp, which we talked about before, can do some pollination. Science doesn't know yet what would happen to these pollinator species if the plant went extinct. And the reverse is also true. If native bees were to go extinct, it would likely threaten the pitcher's thistle even more. So to finish up, I'd just like to talk a little bit about the importance of pollinator gardens, which is what you'll all be creating this month. I think that planting a pollinator garden is the most important thing we can do to protect pollinators because it provides much needed food for bees and is also relatively simple. It's also beneficial for humans because it adds beauty to our landscapes. I hope you'll enjoy planting your gardens and remember to take a look at flowers in the spring and see if you can find any bees. Waiwanan, and thank you for participating. If you have any questions about your plants, please feel free to contact me at jrobbins@menominee.edu, and I'll be happy to help with whatever questions you have. You can also find more information on prairienursery.com.